Hi everyone, I'm Marissa and my final project is on Filipino immigrant experiences with Hawaiian Pidgin English. And I wanted to find out more about the Filipino immigrant experiences with Pidgin in my community specifically, and how Pidgin plays a role in the assimilation of these immigrants into Hawaii's local culture. So just a brief background on what Pidgin is. Pidgin is the language spoken in Hawaii by many locals. It's also known as Hawaiian Creole English or simply Pidgin. It originated from the plantation era, specifically in the first sugarcane plantation in 1835. It represents the languages of at least 6 different ethnic groups, including English, Hawaiian, Japanese, Chinese, Portuguese, and Filipino. So what happened was basically during the plantation era, those who were in power were primarily English speakers, and all these different immigrant groups needed a common language. And so they used whatever English they could hear to communicate with each other. And in doing so, they kind of mixed in features of their own language into it. And thus Pidgin was born. So in Hawaii, Pidgin is generally accepted as the language of the local. And as stated in Labrador 2004's article, it has come to symbolize Hawaii's multiculturalism and the ideologies of mixing, acceptance, equality, and assimilation. So this quote here basically sums up what many local people might say about Pidgin. Pidgin is inclusive, a reflection of our historical attitudes and the value placed on getting along and trying to find common ground. It is non-hierarchical and puts people on an even footing. However, even though Pidgin is a marker of inclusivity for a lot of people, it is definitely not the case for everyone. In the Labrador 2004 article, a point of discussion is that local identity and Pidgin go hand in hand, and local identity actually excludes groups that are considered non-local, and this includes immigrants. He quotes in the article that from this perspective, local identity is very exclusive rather than all inclusive, and serves to create and maintain social boundaries between groups. And in relation to this, I found another resource from an author named Scott Saft called Exploring Multilingual Hawaii, where there's a section on immigrant Filipinos and how they were seen as inferior from the start during the plantation era. So even before they moved to Hawaii, Filipinos were subject to stereotypes, and they were seen as one inferior racial group. And basically there was a wide social distance between Filipinos and other ethnic groups because of the way they were viewed as inferior. So in putting together all the background research that I did, I wanted to find out more about how Filipino immigrants in my local community experience Pidgin and whether or not it played a role in how they assimilated into Hawaii's local culture. And so my method of data collection was through interviews. I interviewed 9 participants who were born in the Philippines and migrated to Hawaii. Their ages ranged from 23 to 81. And here's a list of all the participants' ages. And I did these interviews either through the phone or in person. So one of the questions that I asked was, do you speak Pidgin? And if so, how often? And I found that the results varied among the participants, where 2 people said no or rarely, 4 people said sometimes, and 3 people said often. And I found that those who said no or rarely stated that it was because they never really learned how to speak it. because of their profession. Maybe it seemed unprofessional to them, and they would rather use standard English or Filipino because their job allowed them to do so. And that also that they were uncomfortable using it because maybe they would be judged as trying to be seen as local, which is something I will also get into later. But those who did speak Pidgin sometimes or often, it all depended on who they were talking to, and they spoke it comfortably among family, friends, and acquaintances who also spoke Pidgin. Another question I asked them was on their first impressions of Pidgin and whether it was easy or hard for them to understand. Most participants, 6 out of 9 of them, said that Pidgin was initially hard for them to understand and that it was confusing. One person said it sounded aggressive, like they're fighting, and that it was just much different, or it sounded, they could tell it was broken English, and that it was much different than standard English. They found the vocabulary or the pronunciation of words difficult to understand. There was some people who had negative views about it and even looked down upon it. However, there are also some who expressed curiosity and non-judgment towards it. So the remaining 3 participants said that it wasn't necessarily hard for them to understand Pidgin. And what I found was that these 3 participants were actually the youngest of those who I interviewed. One person said that it wasn't that foreign to them because they picked up on it easily as they did with English. It was easy to understand and just easier to get used to. And this makes sense to me because I found that the participants here, since they came here when they were adults, it makes sense that they had a harder time understanding Pidgin because a lot of them already had some prior knowledge or education on standard English, whereas those who came here when they were little kids had almost no or very little fluency or proficiency in English. So it does make sense that they picked up on it much easier. Another question I asked was, did Pidgin help you better communicate with locals? Or would you say that speaking Pidgin helped you assimilate into the local culture in Hawaii? So the results were kind of split between yes and no on these questions, but I did find among the responses the common theme of acceptance. So a lot of these participants said that Pidgin played a role in how they became accepted, or how Pidgin would help them become more accepted within the community. So one person said, if I speak a little bit of the language, then maybe they can accept me better, or you feel like you're a part of them if you speak their language. However, there was one participant who said, when speaking to a local, I'll go on the safe side and not use Pidgin because for them, maybe it's not acceptable. So here we see 2 different viewpoints on Pidgin and acceptance. And this kind of leads to my next slide, which is the theme of exclusion and judgment. There are some people who expressed feeling judged for speaking Pidgin, while others felt judged for not speaking Pidgin. So in these examples here, it says, when you speak fluent English, they look at you like you're weird, or they told me I spoke funny because I didn't speak like them in Pidgin. So there's also another point of view which says, if I use Pidgin with local people, maybe they would say, I'm trying to be local, or you shouldn't do that because you're not local. And so in these statements, we can see that Pidgin and local identity go hand in hand. And that we can refer back to Labrador's article, which said that Pidgin was a marker of prestige and a badge of honor, marking localness. And I was definitely surprised when I wasn't surprised, but when I heard these statements from my interviews, I immediately thought back to this reading and how a lot of it, uh, it just clicked back to the reading that we read in class earlier in the semester. So my conclusion and takeaways from this study is that the use of pidgin among Filipino immigrants in Hawaii varied, and also their experiences with pidgin varied. Many participants felt that pidgin helped them feel more accepted. However, there are also some who felt excluded because they didn't speak pidgin, or some felt judged because they tried to speak it. There are also a lot of different factors to consider that impact the experience of each participant, including the age that they moved here, when they moved here in Hawaii, how old they were. I found that the younger people definitely had an easier time with pidgin and assimilating into the culture, whereas those who are older, it was way harder for them to understand. Also, the proficiency of English prior to coming here, I would say definitely had an impact as well on their understanding of pidgin, and also the influence of their family here. So I know that there are some participants who had family with a Caucasian background, and also family with a more local or Hawaiian family members. And so that could also play a role in their use of pidgin. But one thing that I found for sure in all of this was that pidgin is indeed a marker of privilege in Hawaii, and that a lot of Filipinos here have this experience with pidgin. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you for listening.